Yeah, welcome. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to having you here in our side event, which is co-hosted by IIASA and Terry on the topic of ratcheting up the NDCs. We will talk about consistent national roadmaps towards a global objective of 1.5 and 2 degrees. Our side event is heavily building upon the so-called CD Links project. That's a project which is funded by the European Commission, but which has 19 international partners brings together 19 international partners that work together on exploring the implications for climate policies for sustainable development and looking into the consistency of near-term climate action that we can observe globally and in different countries with the long-term objective which to keep warming well below 2 degrees or even to 1.5 degrees. I'm the moderator of the session. So my name is Keywan Riahi from the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. We have a panel of 5 experts from the CD Links project. I want to give you perhaps some introduction about the context of the work that we are doing, and then pass on to my colleagues for 5 distinct presentations. I think I don't have to explain to anybody here about the Paris Agreement, but I think one thing which was a major success of the last COP, but one thing particularly important to observe about the Paris Agreement is, and this is a study that has been done by colleagues from the CD Links project with other partners together, which basically gives an overview of the scientific literature and the understanding of where do us the NDCs from the Paris Agreement lead actually by 2030 compared to what is needed. And as you can see from this graph, I think relatively nicely, the orange part is where the NDCs will end up. There is a significant gap to what you need in terms of 2-degree pathways, although the positive side of the story is that there's also some significant reductions too when there is no climate policy. So what we need is this ratcheting up process, and within this ratcheting up process is enormously important to understand, to dig deeper from the global perspective and to look at real national circumstances. And I would say that's the feature of the project that we are all working together here, that CD Links brings together international, globally oriented research teams with a host of different leading research teams within the countries to look into country strategies that might be consistent with a global strategy towards our climate objectives. And we have here partners from the US, from Brazil, India, China, Korea, Japan, Russia, from different countries in the European Union. And this partnership is, I think, something really novel in the sense of in the scientific community. The other important thing that we have to understand is that INDCs are not sufficient, as I mentioned before. They need to be strengthened in parts of the world. At the same time, we have another enormously important international agreement out there, the Sustainable Development Goals, which were more or less adopted at the same time as the climate agreement. And climate is actually one of those, is one objective in these SDGs. But we need to understand how the climate policy actually interacts with these other 16 objectives that are out there. So what are the implications from climate policy mitigation for hunger, for water, for air pollution? How can we resolve potential trade-offs, and how can we benefit for synergies that might be there with these other objectives? Because that will be essential whether a ratcheting up at the local and national scale at the end will be possible. So, and this is also a major emphasis of our project. In sum, we will have now 5 presentations. First, we will have 2 presentations by Elmar Kriegler from PIC, the Potsdam Institute for Climate Change Impact, and by Volker Krey from the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis. Dr. Kriegler will focus on transformation pathways. So first of all, showing you global results from transformation pathways and their regional implications. And after those presentations, the two initial presentations, we take some comments, and so basically we have some time for questions and answers, and then we have a second block of presentations which I introduced later, and at the end we will have half an hour time for discussion with the whole panel. But with that, let me give the panel to you, Elmar, for the first presentation.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Keywan, for the introduction, and good afternoon, everybody. I very much appreciate that you have come to this side event after almost 12 days of conference. So we are trying hard to not to be boring here, but really telling you some interesting insights. As Keywan already pointed out, my task will be to set the stage for the subsequent presentations and talk about global transformation pathways to 1.5 and 2 degree targets, the well below 2 degree targets. You most likely have seen these pathways before, but we here will show new results from a study that looked comparatively into 1.5 degrees and 2 degree pathways. And before I do that, let me show you, Keywan, could you pass me the clicker? Let me show you the scope of the challenge one more time, using this very effective graphic put together by Malte Mainshausen and colleagues. And here you can see how the deposal space in the atmosphere is filling up with our emissions year by year. It's accumulating and it's increasing in speed because the emissions increase over time every year. So this is an acceleration, and we are clearly on a crash course towards the 2 degree budget and now even the 1.5 degree budget. The big question will be, since time is not on our side, as John Kerry said yesterday in his speech before the COP plenary, will we be able to reverse the increasing trend of emissions? That's the first thing we need to do, to peak, and then halt the emissions accumulation in the atmosphere in time for staying below the 1.5 degree or 2 degree budget. And as you can see already from the graphics, this will require eventually to come to emissions neutrality, so no net zero emissions into the atmosphere. Now, pathways are describing a way forward in order to achieve these goals. Here you can see two scenarios, two pathways from a range of models. That's why you see the funnels. It's not just one model, it's a range of models to get a feeling for the uncertainty. And the upper one in yellow shows you an INDC trajectory. So until 2030, you have the INDCs and then some extrapolation of the stringency reflected in the INDCs. Of course, models differ a bit how it is extrapolated, but what we can see, it's definitely not bringing us close to a 2 degree pathway, which you see in light blue. So the dynamics of these pathways, and that's the same for 2 degrees and 1.5 degree pathways, is that you need to peak as early as possible by redirecting investments from the fossil fuel sector into low carbon and efficiency solutions, then have a phase of steep decarbonization that is characterized by power sector decarbonization, which goes first, and coal phase out, not only in the power sector, but also in other sectors, which is absolutely critical in order to get the major emissions out of the system. Finally, we reach carbon neutrality, and here we have questions of how we compensate or eliminate emissions from freight transport, from aviation, from shipping, from heavy industry, from agriculture. These are the very hard to decarbonize emissions, and a lot of side events here at COP were about the question of what to do about those in the medium term. And as you can see, there is, in the end, is net CO2 removal in most of these scenarios. The majority of scenarios already for well below 2 degrees do use negative emissions, to compensate the residual emissions. That's the most important use of those, and to compensate to some extent an overshoot of the budget. If you look now into 1.5 degrees, we're adding this 1.5 degree scenario to the graphic. You can see it in green at the bottom, and the structure is similar, but the qualitative difference is that we have a steeper emissions reduction in this decarbonization period until mid-century. We reach carbon neutrality earlier, around mid-century, and we have earlier and to some extent also more CO2 removal in this 1.5 degree pathways. So what we can clearly see, the gap between the INDCs and the 1.5 degrees is even wider than it is for 2 degrees. And that's what we know, that we need to ratchet up action, probably also before 2030, not only after 2030. So I'm showing you here two graphics, just comparing the global greenhouse gas emissions in 2030 across these three scenarios, the INDC, the well below 2 degrees, and the 1.5 degrees. And this is an indicator that has, for example, been published annually by the Emissions Gap Report. You can see the 14 gigatons CO2 between INDC and 2 degrees is about the number that you also get from the UNEP Gap Report. In our study for 1.5 degrees, the gap doubles to 28 gigatons CO2. Looking into 2050, the difference is even larger. But here we all know that, of course, the INDCs are supposed to be ratcheted up over time. So we won't see in 2050, if the INDCs are ratcheted up, something that like we see here on the left-hand side. Now, let us look into the energy CO2 emissions budget until 2050 in these scenarios. And that's relevant because nations are now considering or thinking about deliberating, submitting national greenhouse gas development strategies until 2050. And they come with a level of stringency. And it will be interesting to put what nations put on the table together and see how they link or compare to these global pathways. So we are showing here this national, the global budget for the 2011 to 2050 period for the 4 scenarios. And we're not showing it in gigatons CO2, but rather in emission years. So that's the amount of years you could emit with your 2010 emissions until you fill up the budget. So if you emit, if you have a 40-year number, it means that you're basically on average staying constant. You increase your emissions. If you're above 40 years, you reduce it if you are below 40 years. And you can see for the world that the INDCs, as well as the reference, will not lead to higher emissions annually than for the 2 degrees and the 1.5 degrees, we are of course below these 40 years. So on my last slide, because I have to finish up, I will try to break this down on the country level. And that's a core exercise of CD Links, to take these global results, compare it with country results, interact between national and global modeling teams to see how things match up. So down here, you see again the world results I've shown before. This is the 3 major emitters on the industrialized countryside, where you can see that they are already, in the reference case, stabilizing their emissions. They increase their effort in the INDCs, but they have more to do for the 2 degrees and the 1.5 degrees. And then 3 major emitters on the developing countryside, where you can see that they do have, in these scenarios, more emission space in this metric for 2 degrees, not so much for 1.5 degrees, but that, of course, their baseline and also the current policy trajectories are much higher due to the dynamic development. So there's a huge challenge, and that's a task in our project to explore this and see how we can make ends meet. Thank you.
By Volker Krey, which will focus on the sustainable development for quick questions and answers.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction, and welcome also from my side. As announced by Keywan, I'm now taking essentially looking at the same pathways that Elmar has just introduced, and yeah, look at different sustainability dimensions. Obviously, the SDGs come to mind immediately. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through 17 SDGs in the next 7 minutes or so. Instead, and this is also driven by part of the analysis, we specifically looked at this stage at the interaction or the implications of the climate policy, as just discussed, on 3 other SDGs. The SDG 2 on zero hunger, SDG 3 on good health, and there particularly the relationship with air pollution, and then the water SDG 6. The project is still in an early stage. There is ambition to expand that scope significantly, so look into further SDGs, as well as making this the interactions, or looking at these interactions more symmetrically. So not just look at what does climate policy potentially mean for achieving or not achieving other SDGs, but also what are implications of pushing other SDGs for being able to reach climate targets. Let me immediately jump into some of the results, starting with water. So looking at the water implications of the climate policies just seen. This is a projection out to the year 2050 without specific climate policies in place. You see a significant increase in the water consumption. This is specifically water use in the energy sector. But now adding in climate policy, there is actually, and it's important here, to emphasize single-minded climate policy that essentially ignores explicitly addressing the water dimension. We may see already by implementing existing INDCs, but even more so by moving by ratcheting up towards the 2 degree and the 1.5 degree pathways, we may see an increase in water consumption of the energy system. You may wonder why that is. The reason is, in part, driven by mitigation policy. We see a significant expansion of hydropower, construction of dams, evaporative losses from reservoirs increasing. But also, if you look at this figure, subtracting the big hydropower contribution, looking in more detail at the underlying changes in the portfolio of energy technologies, some of these actually carry, some of the options to decarbonize the system actually drive potentially water use. In this specific case, this would include nuclear power and specifically CCS also. But of course, this portfolio did ignore water constraints or water scarcity issues in the first place. So choosing a technology mix that is adequate to address not only the climate policy dimension, but also the water dimension is a crucial implication of where this analysis hints. And elaborating more on this is part of the research agenda of this project. As a second dimension, we looked specifically at the co-benefits with air pollution. This is analysis that has been done before, is also highlighted in the IPCC's 5th assessment report. So this is a similar story, looking at two types of pollutants, black carbon emissions and sulfur emissions. Here we already apply a whole range of models. That was also shown by Elmar, so to explore a bit the uncertainty dimension in terms of how large these co-benefits may actually end up being. In the no policy case, taking into account current policies in place to reduce air pollution, we see some reduction. And then moving into implementing existing INDCs, there is a modest improvement in terms of reducing pollutant emissions. But then in particular, when moving to 2 and 1.5 degrees, the co-benefits become much stronger. This is specifically the case for sulfur, related to essentially a full phase out of coal use by 2050. Here it's it's actually interesting to look also into the regional implications. So where do the NDCs get us compared to what can 1.5 and 2 degree transformations can get us in terms of air pollution co-benefits. And it turns out that the degree to which the NDCs already let these co-benefits materialize is regionally very different depending on the level of ambition implied in the NDC. So you see for some of the regions here that the orange bar, the NDCs pretty much overlaps with the no policy case, essentially implying that the NDCs do not lead to a very strong decarbonization of the system by 2050, but then definitely moving to the 2.5 and 1.5 to the 2 and 1.5 degree pathways, there is very significant co-benefits materializing, and in some cases this goes much further than what the INDCs deliver. That brings me to the last topic, food security issues, where we also looked at food security implications, more specifically at the population at risk of hunger. The green bar on the left-hand side is the 2005 estimate by the FAO. About 800 million, more than 800 million people were at risk of hunger at that time. How that develops in a reference or business as usual case is of course strongly dependent on socioeconomic, on broader socioeconomic developments here. The specific scenarios underlying here refer to this red bar that you see there, but the range, so taking into account uncertainties in socioeconomic development forward, leads to a very significant uncertainty. But what we were interested in here is if you add on top of that climate policy, does it actually lead to an improvement or adverse side effects on food security? And yeah, the answer is, again, under single-minded climate policy that doesn't take into account these risks of creating adverse impacts on food security, we may see significant increase in population at risk of hunger, mainly for two reasons. On the one hand, there is competition over land. So as you all know, bioenergy is a hot topic here. So depending on how you produce bioenergy, that may drive food prices. On the other hand, agriculture itself is a fairly emission-intensive activity, and that under single-minded policy may lead to significant increases in food prices that mostly affect poor households in developing countries. There is, however, a solution to more inclusive climate policies that address this issue and try to shield, in particular, low-income households or low-income populations from these price signals, may alleviate this problem. The first order cost estimates you can see here are not insignificant, yet they are much smaller than the estimated costs for the transformation, for the climate transformation itself. Again, looking at it from a regional perspective, hotspots here are in sub-Saharan Africa and large parts of Asia, where this may play out most significantly. So it's important to have this in mind. With that said, let me conclude. We find these very significant co-benefits, but also adverse side effects of mitigation policies. There's more analysis required to identify under which specific conditions one or the other materializes, and therefore, and then using that to design effective policies that take a more holistic approach and specifically try to maximize the synergies and avoid the adverse side impacts of climate mitigation policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Volker. Let me open the floor for, we can take some quick questions before we move on to the second block. Bert?
Thank you, Bert Metz, European Climate Foundation. I question the use of the 2011-2050 budgets, not looking beyond that. What you see is that those budgets are much bigger than the budget for the whole of the century. And what you're actually doing is you mask the need for sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere after that. And I wonder whether that is wise, because I could imagine that midterm strategies would have to take into account the need to go negative later. So this might be misleading in terms of the guidance you give to policymakers for the midterm.
Let me collect perhaps a few questions. Yeah, in the back there.
The presentation, I think, by Dr. Kriegler, where you had for the developing countries, you had compared the INDCs with what they are required to do under 2 degrees centigrade. So what was the metric you used to judge that range?
Thank you very much. So if there is no other questions at the moment, can I pass on to you, Elmar, perhaps to start with answering the question?
Is this working? Yeah. Yeah, thanks a lot for these great questions. So first, Bert, to your question. I think we don't mask it because we are using global models. So with every number you see up there for the budget, we do have a full trajectory behind it where we can look into the implications for the second part of the century. And that's different from just using national models that can move out to 2050 and usually only have a time horizon of 2050 without getting a feeling for the global implications and for the post-2050 implications. So we really have in this project the opportunity to look into these implications. And of course, what you are calling for is to do sensitivity analysis on the amount of carbon dioxide removal that is particularly used in the second half of the century. Because you're right, the budget in the second half of the century is net negative, like particularly in the 1.5 degree scenarios. But I should point out that this is also very strongly determined by the mitigation potentials in these hard to decarbonize sectors, aviation, shipping, heavy industry, agriculture. This is driving the use of negative emissions in the second half of the century. Because if you can't neutralize those, you need to compensate them. So research into how we can get rid of these emissions will also reduce the need for negative emissions in the second half century. Now, to your question on the requirements for developing countries, it's very important for me to point out this is not we don't show requirements. These are just the results of the scenarios under the assumption of using the least cost marginal mitigation option. And a lot of them sit in the developing countries. So let me say two more things on this. That means it there can be different allocations of emissions reductions between countries. That's something we want to explore also in the City Links project. And the second one is, and that's why I think Article 6 is so important, these ambitious targets we can only reach with coordination and cooperation, and there will be a need for developed countries to compensate and transfer, to share the burden with developing countries to some extent.
Okay. So I said, so we will move on now to the second part of the presentations. They will focus now, this part will focus on now much more on the national implications. The first presentation is by Professor Niklas Höhne, and he will present a policy perspective, basically looking into how circumstances in different countries. Later on, this will be followed also by presentations, particularly on India as well as on Brazil, which follows Niklas. Niklas.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, this presentation is about policies that are implemented to meet the INDCs. in the project. The CD Links project is a cooperation of many different institutes. On this particular work, I want to mention Gabriela Iacobuta from Wageningen University, but also Mark Rolsma, Helene van Zuust, Michel den Elsen, and Ditlev van Voeren from PBL, who contributed significantly to this work. Within the CD Links project, we look at the individual policies of countries, and we do two things in this work package. We have an overview of the policies that are implemented, and then also do the quantification of these policies individually, and then also pass this quantification on to the global modelers so that they can then do the global pathways based on the most up-to-date and recent information of the short-term developments of emissions. For collecting the climate policies, we haven't started from zero. We used a tool called the Climate Policy Database that has been developed before under other projects, and we use that now to collect the policies that have an impact on greenhouse gas emissions from within this project, the G20 countries, to have a good geographical spread. And this database is open. It's a collaborative platform. It's based on a wiki software. So we welcome everybody to visit that website, and also if you want contribute to it, because it's quite a lot of work to analyze and to collect information on policies in the different countries. We have already prepared a first inventory of policies for the G20 countries, which you can find on the website, the climatepolicydatabase.org. And if you click on a particular country, you'll find policies, and not only climate policies, but policies that have an impact on greenhouse gas emissions or adaptation to climate change. It's not 100% complete yet, because that will be a huge effort, but the intention is to collect policies that have an impact on emissions. And those are not only climate policies, there are other policies as well. And on the bottom, you see the different policies objectives. Usually we, in this forum, often look only at the mitigation policies, but we also include now in this database energy security or energy access policies, air pollution, land use, food security, water, and economic development. That's a huge task, and what we have in there is only the first step. But as I said, this is an ongoing project. We collect these policies with our regional partners. So that within the project, the CD Links projects, we have partners in the various geographies, and hope to make this a valuable resource, not only to this project, but to anybody else who wants to look into the current status of policy implementation. What you see here as colored on the right-hand side is what we call a good practice policy package. It's organized by sectors from top to bottom, and by policy type from left to right. You can see something on efficiency and renewables. These are the columns here. And each box represents an area where we think a certain policy should exist. And green means we found a policy that fits that category, and red means there's still one missing. So that's the overview. And if you zoom in a little bit, that's the one from the US. On the top, you can see on general, we check whether a country has a climate strategy or reduction target, or has national efficiency or national renewable targets. And then for each of the sectors, we look at whether certain support policies are existing or not. And if you click on it, you find information on the individual policy that is implemented. Now, that's searching what kind of policies are there and searching what kind of policies are not there. What we are interested in the project is the quantification of the impact on greenhouse gas emissions. And within the project, we do it in two steps. The first step is to identify from all of these policies that we have, the top 10 that have the largest impact on greenhouse gas emissions. And we there already on the database, you find that list of the top 10 policies that we have identified. There's always a description and an assessment of a key performance indicator, a value that shows you the effect of that policy. That key performance indicator goes to the global models, and they can use it for their quantification. We also want to do quantification standalone. We have not done that yet within this project, the CD Links project, but we have done it with another project with the same partners. This is from a report we just released together with PBL at IIASA on greenhouse gas emission scenarios from major emitting countries. And there we used exactly the same approach. We first scanned all the policies. Here you see the example of China, where you have on the left-hand side a range of policies that are identified, so a cap on coal consumption and a share of gas target and so on. These are then implemented, one by PBL in their model and two by us in an offline spreadsheet tool. And using that, we get a current policy scenario. That's the blue line or blue shaded area here towards 2030. So an up-to-date current policy scenario reflecting the impact of the currently implemented policy. And we compare that to the INDCs, that's the other dots that you see here. And I think that kind of analysis is very important now to see whether countries are indeed implementing the policies that are necessary to meet the INDCs. The blue line, I expect over the years to come, will change because countries are implementing more and more policies. That's a process that takes some time, but that needs monitoring and needs quantification, and that will change. We hope that the INDC itself will change as well. We don't know whether that will happen, but I think what will definitely change is this current policy scenario, and that needs to be done on a regular basis. Another example is the US, and this has been done before last week. So this is still the current policies that are implemented, including the Clean Power Plan. With that quantification and the two approaches, we come to stable emissions from the US if everything stays as it is, and that is not sufficient yet to reach the INDC, which basically requires a downward trend. How that will change, we don't know, but it only tells you that that needs to be done on a regular basis, and within the CD Links project, in the course of next year, we want to have new analysis of the recent developments. With that, I end and want to highlight to you, again, the climate policy database that is used for the CD Links project. If you're interested in using or contributing to it, that's a moment how you can do that right now. Thank you.
From the Terry Institute in India. We'll have now actually two presentations on national perspectives. The first one is on the Indian perspective. Ritu.
Okay, so as part of the CD Links project, we, as was described earlier, are also looking at each of the regional levels in terms of where do the INDCs take us and what can be done in terms of looking at the synergies, the complementarities, etc., between the development goals of the region of the country, as also what has been put forward through the INDCs. So very quickly, I'll put up the scenario for India and take you through some of the challenges and opportunities we see especially in the energy sector with regard to the transitions that are likely to be taking place in India. So if we look at the Indian INDCs, there are three basic targets that the INDC points out. One, it sets an unconditional target of 30 to 35% emission intensity reduction in GDP by 2030 from 2005 levels. That of achieving around 40% renewable energy share by 2030, which is conditional on getting support. And third, in terms of creating a carbon sink of about 2.5 to 3 billion CO2 equivalent through the forestry sector. Now coming to the energy sector, if you try and design some plausible scenarios of what that INDC emission intensity target could sort of look like, then this is how we see that aligning over the years from 2006 to 2030. And if you go through the bars, you would notice the last two bars, which are the lower and the higher emission intensity level for India, basically point to a significant amount of coal, which is still indicated in black. The red part looking at oil, the orange in natural gas, and the little bars on in light green, basically indicating the traditional biomass. So in terms of total energy requirements, when looked at in terms of the MTOE terms, still looks at a fairly fossil-intensive and fossil-dominated energy sector. But what we need to do, even in moving from the business as usual or no policy, no INDC kind of scenario to this, already takes into account these takeaways which we observe from our modeling. So firstly, in the transport sector, this already assumes that petroleum products would need to be increasingly substituted by alternatives such as CNG, electricity, and biofuels. Fuel efficiency of vehicles would need to improve at about 1% per annum over the time period till 2031. Share of efficient appliances in the residential and commercial sectors would need to, again, increase their efficiency very rapidly. And the entire stock of these appliances by 2051 would need to do a complete turnover. So in the sense, it's extremely important that efficient appliances sort of start dominating whatever gets purchased now on and as early on in the entire economy in these sectors as well. By 2031, again, more than 50% of the lighting demand in both urban and rural areas should start getting met by LEDs, and hopefully the LEDs would also improve the efficiencies further. There's also an assumption of increased penetration of green buildings, especially in the commercial sector, improved efficiency of public lighting, waterworks, sewage pumping, etc., efficiency in irrigation equipment, which needs some policy drivers to get tweaked as well, and need for innovation in high-yielding seeds, development of climate-resistant varieties, etc., which are important from the food security perspective as well. Now, if we look at all these elements, many of them and most of them do point to energy efficiency, which I think is a no-brainer in terms of, given the need for a developing country to keep increasing the amount of access and energy basic infrastructure services that it needs to provide, definitely will need to use more and more energy. But at the same time, whatever energy efficiency can do in terms of minimizing this requirement is extremely important. So apart from energy efficiency, the other sector which seems to be extremely important in our case is that of the power sector. The more that we can electrify instead of using the fossil-based fuels in their original form, the more scope there is to, again, decarbonize by moving towards renewables. So that's the other element of trying to get people electrification, which also brings them access to electricity, and at the same time ramping up the speed at which we can decarbonize by moving to renewables. So in terms of management and reduction of sectoral energy demands across end-use sectors, that is one of the main objectives, which again gets tied very closely to what the INDCs should and are planning to bring in the Indian context. And additionally, in terms of decarbonization, moving towards renewables like solar and wind and scaling these capacities rapidly. Looking at storage and solar thermal, this again, from the technological side, is extremely important to happen early on so that that transition can come in and try to replace the huge amount of coal that we saw in the earlier graphs. And again, therefore, it calls really for cleaner advanced fossil fuel technologies also immediately, and need for a robust and balanced power supply grid in trying to enable this transition towards renewables in India. This is again a picturization of the power sector capacity addition, which we would visualize if we looked at the INDC scenario vis-a-vis moving away from a baseline scenario. And if you looked at the year 2031, here you would see a large part in yellow and also in light purple at the top, which are essentially the solar and wind related capacity additions. So although in the energy terms, it looked like a very minor amount in terms of what India seemed to be wanting to do under its INDCs, in terms of the gigawatts of capacity, which needs to be set up to achieve the current INDCs, this is a rather large level. So again, the call really is to be able to do this as quickly as possible. This is nearly about more than 200 odd gigawatts, which needs to happen in the next few years. So the challenge is by no means not daunting. It is a huge challenge. It is something towards which policies are already getting aligned in the country, but we could, of course, do much more in terms of accelerating the speed with which the other challenges which surround this particular sector sort of get lessened simultaneously. So just to very quickly bring in the context of the power sector transformation, again, our power sector needs to balance multiple objectives. INDC is only one of them. The other is, of course, to ensure the development targets of poverty alleviation and inclusive development, wherein the government's first challenge is to provide power for all, and that too in a reliable manner, which is 24 hours, 7 days of the week. So again, that is a very important element and the top priority for the government, undoubtedly. The implication of what we have set in terms of our NDC target is also that in order to do this via renewables and getting this large gigawatt of capacity via renewables there to bring in the required generation also means the need to ramp up the capacity to a much higher level than what we would have had to ramp up if we were using fossil-based fuels. So given the intermittency, there are these other challenges of having to do things in a more costly manner and having to do them in a much larger effort as well. So there are therefore the challenges which come in with regard to the doability of things at a particular speed. Lastly, just to bring this in the context of the national circumstances, I would say that India's INDCs are very ambitious because of the national context of the development needs and poverty alleviation. For example, we have huge adaptation-related needs itself, looking at the limited access to clean drinking water, sanitation, the food and nutritional security aspect, etc. I won't go into details on that. But the thing I want to just point to is that it's extremely crucial for the country to be able to align the steps towards its mitigation goals as well as its development goals. And that becomes a very, very important element, which was also talked about by the earlier panelists. So again, in a situation where we need to manage our growth and the decarbonization, I think this is a very unique position in which a country like India is at the moment, because historically, if we look at any other country, countries have had the luxury to sort of grow initially with a fossil-based development path and then decarbonize. But India needs to do this now at this juncture simultaneously, and that brings with it these additional challenges in terms of looking at different kind of models. So there are several policies. I will not go into details of them because of paucity of time, but on the solar mission, in terms of looking at stepping up renewables, in terms of disincentivizing fossil fuels and having cess on coal, etc. The government has put forward several policies, but again, there are some challenges which are looming large ahead in terms of what India can do and how much it can accelerate even further. And these challenges relate with having access to the desired technologies at affordable costs, in terms of looking at financial resources and the transaction costs associated with finding appropriate business models to suit our needs. Again, I won't go into details on the levels of finance, but this is huge for a country like India, which has great adaptation and development challenges as well. But at this juncture, I think what through this project we want to bring out is that we need to transform these challenges into opportunities and look at the synergistic development of the country in terms of using whatever we can in terms of the second mover advantage and taking advantage of technological leapfrogging, using business models such as the government has already adopted in terms of the perform, achieve, and trade scheme in case of industry, and looking at the procurement of LED bulbs at very low costs. So there are business models, but we do need to scale these up tremendously. We need to adopt every kind of measure there is possible to be able to move successfully towards this end. So I'd just like to end by saying that speed is irrelevant if you're going in the right direction, in the wrong direction. But I think India is going in the right direction. The only thing we need is really to scale up these things in a faster manner, and that can happen with technological progress, but also innovative thinking, innovative models to sort of speed up the entire process. Thank you.
Introduce our last speaker for today, Roberto Schaeffer. He will give us the Brazilian perspective. Roberto.
Okay. Well, good afternoon. Thank you very much for how it's going to complement the presentation by Volker and by Elmar, where they presented a global perspective using global models on some scenarios up to 2050. And my My role here is to present a scenario that we run for Brazil up to 2050 using a national model. And somehow, let's say, some of the boundaries of our runs were given by some carbon budgets by the global model. So somehow, what I'm going to show you here is going to complement very well what was said. Basically, we run 3 different scenarios. Let's say a INDC scenario, where basically, as Elmar has said, let's say we meet the target of the Brazilian INDC by 2030, and then somehow we extrapolate that up to 2050. And then we run 2 other scenarios, which we call a high cap and a low cap, where we have some carbon budgets that we have to meet, or that we are able to meet up to 2050. And somehow, as Elmar already showed, in the case of Brazil, it's interesting that, let's say, in the INDC scenario, in the low cap or high cap scenario, Brazil get more years of, let's say, of emissions than we have between 2010 and 2050. What does it mean? Basically, it means that, let's say, the carbon budget for the energy sector in Brazil would allow Brazil to increase emissions as compared to energy emissions in 2010. So, and Elmar make a comment on that. It basically has to do with the level of development that each country has. In the case of Brazil, for the energy sector, that would allow us to emit more than we emitted in 2010, and even that case, meet our carbon budget, either the NDC, the low cap, or high cap. So here are the results. Then we have some very interesting results. This is a result we get in terms of primary energy. So we see that, let's look at by 2050, because I think the results get more interesting. So basically what it says that the primary energy consumption in Brazil in a INDC scenario would be much lower than a primary energy consumption in Brazil in the high cap and low cap. What's behind that? It's not a contradiction, but basically if we look at what's behind those numbers, is because in order for Brazil to meet a low cap or high cap scenario, it does mean a lot of bio-CCS, a lot of biomass, and a lot of bio-CCS, meaning that not only you have an energy penalty by being able to have that bio-CCS, but also because in the case of biomass use in the energy sector, normally you operate with a lower energy efficiency. So you need more primary energy to be able to meet the same energy services. So this seems to be a contradiction, but it's not. And then I'm going to be commenting a little bit that some of the distinctions between the low cap and the high cap have to do with the level of the electrification of the transport sector, has to do with the role of energy efficiency, the role of energy in industry, and we're going to explore a little bit this now. In the power sector, interesting enough, we do not see any major change in the case of Brazil, either in the INDC scenario, low cap or high cap. Why? Simply because the power sector in Brazil already relies very heavily on renewable energy, though there's not much you can do in the power sector. So most of the transformations we're going to see in Brazil is not in the power sector, but in the other sectors. Industry, transport, and as we're going to show later on, the role that bio-CCS can play in Brazil in case you really want to work with a very low, let's say, carbon budget for the energy sector. And then the only discrepancy that we really see here between the NDC scenario and the other 2 scenarios by 2050 is the role played by coal. Let's say in the NDC scenario, you can still expect some coal in Brazil by 2050. If you're more stringent in terms of carbon budget in the low cap or high cap, then in that case, you do not see coal. And then you see some increase in hydroelectricity, even in some areas where today, let's say for cost reasons, you would not go in that direction. But if you want to put a cap on that, hydroelectricity makes some sense in the case of Brazil. Okay, in terms of final energy, I'm not going to explore much here. Basically, the major difference here is the role energy efficiency can play in industry in Brazil. So if you're going to move from an NDC scenario to low cap or high cap, energy efficiency is pretty important in the case of Brazil. In the transport sector, I said the resolution is not that good. The major change that we see here is the role played by electric vehicles in the Brazilian economy. So if you want to have a low cap or high cap, you need to have more electric vehicles, but also, interesting enough, you need to have more vehicles running on biofuels, not because of biofuels itself, but to create the opportunity of having negative emissions in ethanol distilleries for bio-CCS. If you have time, I'm going to explain a little bit more of this later on. In terms of energy intensity, very interesting and very much related to my first or second slide. The highest energy intensity you get is in the low cap scenario. Simply because, let's say, in order to have less emissions, you have to rely more on biofuels or bioenergy. And by doing that, you need to have more primary energy to be able to meet the same service. So although you have higher energy intensities in the low cap scenarios, of course, as expected, you have a lower carbon intensity because you're using more energy, but energy with low carbon content. So, and this is exactly what we wanted, to have less carbon, and we were not concerned about having more or less energy in the case of Brazil. In terms of total emissions, as expected, let's say in the low cap or high cap scenario, basically Brazil would stabilize by 2050 CO2 emissions from the energy sector at the level that they were by 2010. In the case of the NDC scenario, basically you're going to have much higher emissions by 2050 as compared to 2010. Okay, but I was not happy with that. Okay, I have to complain with my colleagues here. I was not happy to run a national model for Brazil only. So I decided to run a global model, and now we have a global model for Brazil, not for Brazil, a global model developed in Brazil with 18 different regions. And by doing that, we decided to run the same scenarios using a global model and see what was the role of Brazil into that scenario. I don't have time to go into that. So basically, this is the regionalization of our model, 18 different regions. It's important because you want to capture some specificities of some regions. But again, I don't have time to do that. Our model, let's say, covers the entire energy system. So the result that I showed for Brazil before was of a national model that only focused on the energy system. But now in our global model, you also have forest, and we also have, let's say, agriculture into it with very detailed representation of that. Okay, what about the results? When we run our global model and then look, we get some very interesting and different results. So for example, in that case, when we run a scenario, a low cap scenario for the globe and see what is the role of Brazil, then we see that Brazil needs to have negative emissions from the energy sector by 2025, which was not what we got in a low cap scenario for Brazil, just looking at Brazil. So these are the results when we run the global model for Brazil. And more interesting than that is when I run this global model of Brazil, not looking only at the energy sector, not looking only at CO2 emissions. Here I have 18 regions, all gases, all sectors of the globe. And then we see that in that case, the emissions of Brazil that would be compatible with a 2-degree world are the ones shown in the green line. So basically see that for Brazil to meet, or for the globe to meet a 2C scenario with the lowest cost, the optimum trajectory for Brazil would be the green line. And interesting enough, I decided to plot here the Brazilian ambition with its INDC in 2025 and 2030. And what you see here is that the Brazilian INDC is exactly where it should be by 2025, 2030, if we aim for a 2-degree globe with a minimum cost. So I was glad to see that. I'm not defending the position of Brazil, but just so that it was a complete coincidence. That's true. The Brazilian government has not seen that yet. This is the first, let's say, public presentation of these results. But funny enough, according to our models, the Brazilian INDC is exactly where it's supposed to be for a 2-degree world at a minimum cost. Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Roberto. Let me, it was very reassuring to know, Roberto, that it's so easy to make you happy that you even, if you make additional runs, that you are more happy within the project. That was great to learn. Let me take direct question, so clarification question for the last 3 talks first, and then we open to questions and discussions with the full panel. So if you have any questions. It was a lot of material, I know.
Good afternoon. My name is Gustavo from IPEA in Brazil. I have a question to Roberto. It's just because I'm Brazilian and I was wondering the absence of solar power and in the graphics. And I understand that the model was probably forcing towards the use of biofuels with the intention to have CCS and negative emissions. But as a Brazilian, I'm wondering, since I live in a house and I have a roof, if I have an electric car, I believe I would charge my batteries inside my own house and would not pay for very expensive electricity that is done with biofuels or biomass. And yeah, I'm wondering if this kind of realistic cost-benefit analysis was done for the individuals that are buyers of electricity.
Let me collect perhaps two other questions on this side. Yes.
Question for Dr. Ritu Mathur. In these, when you are modeling for the reduction in energy efficiency, are you looking at the fact that are you assuming that the current distribution of the different sectors of the economy is roughly similar? So what kind of assumptions do you feed in on the structural composition of the economy? And the second is that in the context of India, would you also factor in rebound? So, you know, that it's not a mix of requirements, but that new requirements will appear as energy becomes available on the large scale from the micro.
Okay. Let me take another question over there.
This is a question perhaps to anybody on the panel. I didn't follow the results on nuclear across all the presenters, but most of these models derive their outcomes based on the costs associated with each of these technologies, right? Whereas we know that nuclear is more driven by sentiment. So given that there is still a significant contribution of nuclear in the climate-friendly scenarios, how do we sort of rationalize the role that nuclear will play and have something which is representing what is a likely outcome, as opposed to just sort of scenarios that say that, okay, this is the share. That's typically how most models, from my understanding, handle nuclear. But how do you think it's best to present the role of nuclear to policymakers and to show them the importance of it?
Yeah, so let me, Roberto, let me pass on the question on the solar assumptions in Brazil first.
Okay, so answering this question, our national model has solar energy very well represented. We have not only distributed energy using solar, but also concentrated CSP, PV. The issue is that because the power sector in Brazil is extremely clean already, for a model to choose solar energy, because in some of our runs, solar energy would basically replace hydro and other energy sources, even wind. So that's why, let's say, we have this technology in our model, but again, unless you ask for or you're forced on a cost basis, the model does not choose solar more than we already have seen or have shown, which is already cost competitive, which is in the case of distributed solar energy. So we have some, perhaps we cannot see there, but again, when you have, the model prefers to choose energy efficiency, and normally energy efficiency will basically compete with solar in Brazil, because since solar is the marginal technology, with energy efficiency, the model does not go to solar because energy efficiency already played that role, okay? Very briefly, let's say most of the scenarios here are based on macroeconomic scenarios that they have macro consistency. So basically, let's say we run economic scenarios that are consistent. So basically, we take into account eventually changes in the structure of the economy, okay? And somehow this, based on this new economy, that you have the energy services, and then your model chooses to meet those energy services. And finally, very briefly, about nuclear. Nuclear is very interesting because it's the only technology that as time goes by, gets more expensive. So basically, at least in our models, we don't need to worry about, let's say, any other consideration but cost. And in the case of Brazil, nuclear is never competitive. It's extremely expensive. So there are many, many other energy options than nuclear. So that's why we don't even need to be concerned about other things behind nuclear. Just on a cost basis is already very non-competitive.
Can I pass on to you, Ritu, for the question on Indian assumptions, rebound, etc.?
Yeah, so very quickly, coming to the structural composition of the economy, yes, we do look at injecting some effect of the policies which are currently on ground, for example, the Make in India kind of policy to give an impetus to the industrial sector. So some past trends continued, but incorporating the suggested moves of the government have been incorporated into the structural change components so far. But we also run complementary CGE models wherein we allow the structural changes to happen to also look at how changing the structure could make the INDCs more effective by increasing the value add from different kind of sectors. So that part was not presented here, but that's done within the project as well. On the question on the rebound, yes, again, we do factor that in because we break down every demand and every consuming category into many, many disaggregated classes. For example, in terms of residential consumption, it is consumption which is differentiated between the poorest class and the richest class, etc., across 12 different classes. So you look at a progression of how people will change their consumption patterns over time, and also as they would become increasingly richer, what they would consume and how the rebounds, etc., would occur.
Yeah, thank you very much. Elmar or Volker, do you want to respond perhaps to the question also about nuclear and how you treat nuclear in your analysis?
Yeah, I think it's an important point. I mean, future will tell, will teach us where the costs go. From my perspective, what is much more important to include than claiming one has the best cost estimates for nuclear is looking at it from a multi-criteria perspective. So not just looking at it as a energy providing or electricity providing technology, but also see like how does it contribute or not contribute to the water scarcity, what are potential benefits for energy security, but then of course also the disaster risk, proliferation issues, and so on. So I think looking at it from a more holistic perspective than just at the benefits that may be there for climate is probably a much more useful thing to do, than just doing cost minimization vis-a-vis climate policy.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have seen other questions. I think there was one here in the front. Actually, there are many hands now. Please stay up with your hands. They can see who it was. First row. Second row. So in the front, please. Question first. Thank you.
Hey, Guy from Uppsala University. This one's for Roberto. So I want to know, in the model you've got proposed, what for the biomass with CCS, what methodology you're using with that? Because if it's the BECCS model, it's never been proven at scale, and the scale for Brazil is like ludicrously big. I'm just wondering what kind of measures you've put into that. Also, in regards to that, and also biofuels, if you're going to be meeting the SDGs and the pure expansion of biofuels and deforestation for agricultural purposes as the population increases, food security is one of the SDGs. So if you're going to meet all the others, you have to meet this one as well, and it just seems they're incompatible at the moment. Yeah, and I think that's it. Yeah.
Thank you. Another question here. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Daniel Buira from the DDPP team in Mexico. And I have a question for Dr. Mathur from Terry. I saw CNG vehicles, I thought, in the transport mix. And this question is about emissions lock-in. And I know this is more about NDCs, but we all hope NDCs increase their ambition eventually. And so just any reflections there on the Mexico side. There's interest in gas vehicles from the federal government, from city governments, and we're trying to encourage people to think of other options. And any reflections on that? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Another question in the second row?
I've also a question to Mrs. Ritu Mathur. When I combine your presentation with what we've heard before by Elmar Kriegler, who told us that like the current NDCs doesn't lead us to 2 degrees and we have very steep emission reductions required. And I saw that in your scenario to coal, I think it was like a 200 gigawatt in 2020 and an increase to about 500 gigawatt by 2030. So a really huge increase. So wouldn't that be like also a lock-in of emission? And the question would be, have you also considered or calculated different scenarios for India? Or do you know, can you tell us maybe which are factors or parameters behind that would maybe influence that scenario?
Great. Let me take another question. I think Brigitte Knopf, you want? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Brigitte Knopf from the Mercator Institute, MCC. Thank you all. Thank you especially to Niklas, pointing to the importance of policy instruments. I have actually 2 questions. So one is, yesterday CDP said that carbon pricing is mentioned in about 100 NDCs. And I was wondering, can you comment on this? Because I also heard other numbers, and which role does carbon pricing play in the INDCs or in the NDCs and that kind of policies? And the second point is, I didn't quite get the link between the policy analysis and policy instrument analysis and the modeling work. And I was wondering, Niklas, you showed these large tables and you said, well, you can implement this in the models and see the outcome and the progress, what is very much appreciated. But then I was also wondering, are you also going to analyze which kind of policies are really the most important ones, or in which sectors are the most important policies needed, so that policymakers can see, okay, we really have to concentrate on this sector and, well, let's forget about the other sectors. So what is the link between the policy instrument analysis and the modeling? Thank you.
Yeah, I think this was an excellent set of questions. Let me start perhaps again on this side of the table with Roberto with the question to you, and then let us move up.
Okay, thank you for the questions. In our case, let's say bio-CCS does not come from power generation. In fact, let's say it's extremely expensive to have, let's say, CCS in coal power plants, in natural gas power plants, and in biomass power plants. What's really cheap, and very few people are paying attention to that, is in the ethanol production. When you have the fermentation process of moving from sugar into ethanol, you have a stream of almost pure CO2. It's 95% CO2 and 5% something else. So it's extremely cheap to do that. In our model, the cost of capturing CO2 from a ethanol distillery is roughly between $30 and $40 per ton of CO2. And this is already being done in Brazil. So you're not talking about a pilot project. So we already have, it's typical from the ethanol distillery to capture some CO2 and sell that CO2 to the food and beverage industry. So it's basically, it's much more an issue of scale than technology. So in our case, our model is deciding to look for bio-CCS in ethanol distilleries. What happens? Such a CO2 is so cheap, then the reason to have ethanol is not because ethanol as a fuel, but to have negative CO2. And then the opportunity cost of ethanol goes down to zero. And then the model begins to use ethanol, as we have done in the past in Brazil, in buses, for power generation, in turbines for power generation, which allows the model to choose more solar and wind, because a ethanol burning turbine is very responsible That's all very responsive for, let's say, turning on and off. So you can have more solar and wind because you have power generation from ethanol. So in our case, according to numbers, okay, what about the competition between food and biofuels? There's some problem with that numbers because people do not pay attention that what really takes space in the world is not food, it's cattle. In the case of Brazil, the agriculture of Brazil is the second largest in the world. And cattle in Brazil takes 3 times more space than food. So just to give some numbers very briefly, cattle in Brazil uses 200 million hectares of land. Agriculture, 70. Ethanol, 7. So you could multiply, let's say, the production of ethanol by 20 or 25 without any competition with agriculture. The issue here is eventually, I'm not defending that, but the issue of changing diet is really the big issue here. And about, let's say, another comment. Okay, I'm going to stop here. Okay.
Thank you, Ritu.
No, I think, again, a very important and excellent set of questions. And just to bring in the perspective, I think this is something which is key in case of India and something we have been talking both at the national policy making level, but also at the levels of modeling at the India and global levels. The lock-in question is, I think, the most important key element in the transition story for the country. The lock-ins, for example, and the 2 examples came up very clearly here in, say, the transport sector. Now, if we are looking at modeling, and here I would like to point out models are, of course, sort of gaze ahead and in giving you some kind of directions, but not deterministic. These are the options which we could have. These are the options we would have because of behaviors and choices people will make. However, what I wanted to point out is if the technologies are available at an affordable rate and it can change the behaviors or flip the patterns, there is, of course, no need for us to say that people should use CNG. People should use electric vehicles. But in a scenario where you don't have enough electricity, the first priority is never going to be electric vehicles. In a scenario where the affordability is cheaper with a CNG vehicle or any other vehicle, this is not going to happen. So those are the restrictions when it comes to being able to do the leapfrog, though that might be the best alternative. So I think the plea here is for technologies to become affordable, scalable, and then that leapfrog can happen. The same example, again, in terms of the power sector. We realize that we need to go the renewables path. The policies are towards that path. We do not want to lock us into that much of coal, definitely. But you need balancing of power in the grid. So you do need either coal or gas or something at the moment which is still fossil. Do we have the technology for storage at the level where the grid can go to 100% renewable? No. Do we have this availability at costs which are cheaper than fossil? No. So the answers are staring us in the face. As soon as the technological options and the systemic way of being able to manage it becomes available, we can leapfrog, and we should leapfrog. And the modeling is only allowing us to gaze into that space and say, hey, if this is available much faster, we can do this much faster. So that's also, I think, the element which we need to see as the conditional versus unconditional INDCs. If it's available globally, I do not think that any country, whether developing or developed, would shy away from jumping to a technological alternative which is more efficient and cleaner. We have enough problems, not only at the global level, but also the local level. So trying to contain the environment to sustainable levels is, I think, a key priority, but the key element being technological availability at affordable prices.
Great. Niklas. Yeah, thanks for the questions on the policies. First part was on how much carbon pricing is in the INDCs, and we didn't do a detailed analysis of it, but many of the INDCs are not as detailed to say which kind of policies are implemented to reach them in the end. So what we have looked at is which policies are implemented in the countries, assuming that they are meant to reach the INDC in the end. And if you go to the policy database, there's an overview of how many of the G20 countries have implemented overarching carbon pricing scheme or emission limits in the electricity sector, and that's 44%. So, well, 44%, that's half maybe, or close to half. And those kinds of analysis can show you where there's a lot of policy instruments used and where there's little policy instruments used. And that's to your last question, what can we learn from it? So we can see that half of the countries use carbon pricing or emission limits in the electricity sector. We see that all of the G20 countries have support schemes for renewables. Or you can say that only 31% of the G20 countries have limits to reduce emissions from methane emissions from landfill. So you can look at all of the different policy areas, see which countries are doing which, and that gives you some indication of where activity is happening or where more has to happen to reduce emissions in the long term. Then your middle question was the link from the policy analysis to the models, and I skipped that because I rather wanted to use my 8 minutes for the results. But the way we do it is we look first at all the quantitative information that is in the policies, the policy targets in terms of, for renewables, it could be feed-in tariffs, what's the value of the feed-in tariffs, or if it's renewable portfolio standards, how much renewables should come in. And we translate that either with offline calculations or with impact analysis from other studies, translate that into standard indicators that then the models, the global models, can use. And the standard indicator should be the share of solar or the megawatts of solar installed in a certain year, which then can be taken by the global models, or the megajoules per passenger kilometers in passenger transport. Those kinds of standard indicators that then can be taken forward. And that can then be used to calculate the long transition pathways after 2030.
Yeah, can I perhaps, Elmar, do you want to comment on the questions that have been raised?
Very quickly, I would like to pick up on two questions. The one was how to bridge the gap between these global results showing very ambitious emissions reductions in all countries and globally, and then the INDC analysis presented by Ritu. And I think the answer here is that's exactly the two sides of the conversation we need to have, right? And models are discourse instruments, so they're not producing any, they're not foretelling the future or something, and we have to do what's in the models. It's just to have a discourse about this. And we definitely want to have a conversation in the project where we are mindful of the requirements of the long-term targets and as well mindful of the national circumstances and the development needs of the countries. And in this tension between the two, or maybe there are also synergies to find, we will develop the conversation, and we definitely will look, of course, into scenarios that go beyond the INDCs that are put on the table right now, also on the national level, to see how low you can go actually in these countries, something we have still before us. And yeah, I think that's what I want to say.
Yeah, thank you very much. We have perhaps time for one or two quick questions at the end. Yeah, if not, then I would like to thank everybody for joining us today. This is actually a relatively young project, so it's now 1 year that we're working together, still 3 years to go. And even considering that, we could only present actually the tip of the iceberg, what is done now. So there's much more research in different other countries, including, for example, Russia or Japan, yeah, a number of other countries that we're looking into as well. I should mention that there are also case studies about how policies have been working in the past, and how those policies have influenced or how successful they have been. So what are the barriers there? And there's actually one case study that we are looking into conditions for nuclear. So under which circumstances did nuclear scale in the past, and under which did it not scale? Actually, one of the conclusions is that it really matters, the size of the country really matters. It's whether it's able to nuclear power plant if you compare it to the sizable, relatively small solar PV installations. So something that and there are many other case studies, empirical studies in the past. And then finally, one thing that we want to do next and can perhaps report back to you is we want to understand not only what is a viable transformation pathway for these different countries, but what does it mean if we fail in one country or the other, for how much other countries, how much the rest of the world could actually compensate for loss in action. So that's something which will keep us busy, I would say, for the next few years to come, but is also in the pipe as an analysis from the City Links project. So you saw the flyers in front of you. There's a web page. So if you're interested, please go to the web page and get in touch with us with any questions that you have. And thank you for joining us today in the evening. Thank you.